Okay, let's kick this thing off. So again, everyone, thanks for joining. My name is Adam Tank, Chief Customer Officer at Transcend. We are a software company in the water wastewater industry that is actively changing the way that capital projects are done, specifically water and wastewater treatment works. And part of the discussion today will revolve around exactly how we see the world in terms of where we sit with consulting engineers, as an innovation provider, and with the utility or the asset owner. But we've also invited Kim Baker from Elemental to join. I'll let her introduce herself in a second, but Kim is a former engineer and now investor in early stage water and wastewater technologies. So she has a bit of a different perspective on innovation in the market. Kim?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for having me, Adam and Transcend team. Just a bit of a quick brief on my background, and I'll jump into what Elemental does here shortly. So as Adam mentioned, I started as a consulting engineer. I worked for what was URS at the time, now AECOM. Did all kinds of very large infrastructure projects, was part of the original California Climate Action Registry's greenhouse gas reporting initiative. So really understood how to collect data to make actionable decisions, which I know is a hot topic these days, and really did all types of projects out from, design work to a year-long field tenure. And the one thing that I always loved is that there were so many stakeholders involved in these projects. It was really a project management feat to bring all of the right people to the table. And I think that's something that we'll talk about today. After that, I started a company in wastewater, industrial wastewater management, pulled that up through kind of the early stage steps of a company that a company goes through, and then went on to work for a growth stage company as a senior product manager in the drinking water space. So I've worn a number of hats, which I love to bring to the table as we consider new technologies, new partnerships, new sales channels. It's all very fun to kind of relive some of the experience that I've lived through. So happy to be here. Adam, I'll pass it back to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Kim. So for everyone that's on the webinar, we do have a short question for you that we'll bring up here in a second. So as you know, this webinar is focused on talking about whether or not engineering consulting firms are adapting to the changes that are happening in the water wastewater industry, specifically around innovation and innovative technologies. So we're going to show a poll here in a second. We want everyone to vote on this poll. It's pretty simple. You just click the vote button and we'll share the results. The question is going to be, do you believe that engineering consulting firms help or hinder new innovative technologies from being adopted in the water and wastewater industry? So let's bring up the poll and see how people vote. Do consulting engineers help or hinder bringing new technologies to market?
I feel like we need some Jeopardy music here.
Yeah, exactly. We've got 4 people that have chimed in so far. We're at 50-50. We now have 5 people. We're now trending towards hinder. 6 people now heavily leaning towards hinder. Okay, 7 now even more heavily towards hinder. All right, interesting.
We should have made everybody guess before voting what the breakdown is going to be.
That's a good point. Okay, I think that's everyone that doesn't include Kim and I. So, so this is interesting. I'm not sure that everyone can see what the results on the screen, but to read it to you, it's either help or hinder as you voted on. So 2 out of 7 said that the consulting engineers help. 5 out of 7 said that they hinder innovation and new technology in the consulting engineering industry or in the water industry, which is pretty fascinating. So the goal of today's webinar is to talk about why this might be the case, whether they help or hinder, and what we're actually seeing from real world implementations of advanced technologies in the market. So I'm going to present first on what we see as Transcend happening, specifically around what we do and whether or not consulting engineers are helping or hindering the process. And then Kim's going to present on her view from an investor's perspective. So she sees hundreds of new water wastewater technologies a year, maybe even monthly, And she has to determine if they're a good fit for the Elemental portfolio as an investor. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and make sure I do this appropriately. Okay. Right. And here we go. All right. So the question we are trying to answer today is whether or not we believe consulting firms are helping or hindering the advancement of new technologies in water, wastewater. And where we sit as Transcend and what we see happening is that the world, quite frankly, at large, is at an inflection point. And the inflection point is this, that there's a shift from manual tasks performed by humans to automated processes powered by machines. And you can see that this is true in basically almost every major industry on earth, whether it's healthcare, where we see big data AI playing a role in helping diagnose different issues with a patient. In finance, obviously, AI-powered trading algorithms. The blockchain, of course, is a big innovation. And then, of course, transportation. So if any of you have ever been in a self-driving car or maybe own one, it's pretty wild to think where we're going to be in the very near future relative to people driving cars or not. This is a good example. If you look at Wall Street roughly 100 years ago, here's what you would have seen. Hundreds, if not thousands of people literally yelling over one another, trading paper tickets. That's not a very efficient process. Now, of course, you walk on the trading floor and it's been largely replaced by monitors and algorithms on the back end that are doing a lot of that trading automatically. Of course, you have humans that are really analyzing the data, being smart about it, but of course the dynamics have changed drastically. Interestingly, with an operating room, dozens of people focusing on one patient, and now in some cases, surgery is completed with one or two surgeons or a surgeon and a tech with robotics. And in some cases, the surgeon is not even in the same room as the patient. They're in another part of the world performing that surgery. It's pretty incredible. This is one of my favorite videos that shows sort of this, what the benefits are of adopting innovation, or really what the differences are in people who have and have not innovated. So I'm going to play this video for you. What I want you to think about or look at is the difference between 1981 Formula One team and the 2019 Formula One team. And look at the differences between the two. Just a little bit different. If you wouldn't mind, drop some things in the chat that you noticed. Talk about some of the differences that you've seen between the 1981 and the 2019 teams, or maybe even similarities too. Be curious to get your thoughts. I'll share one of mine. And again, your chat feature is down at the bottom of your screen. It's a little button that you click on and you can type your responses in the chat. One of the things that I notice is that the team in 2019 is using innovative tools, new technologies in order to perform their job better. Roughly the same amount of people for each team. So just like Remy said in the chat, still humans involved in the process, but they're so much more effective because they're using advanced technologies, innovations in technology. Anyone else? Anything else you've noticed that you want to talk about? Go ahead and put it in the chat.
Well, Adam, the time is probably stating the obvious because we all just watched it, but the time is just drastically different. And I have to think, we're in a world where we're all about speed, not necessarily on a race course going in circles, but for everything we do, it's a race to the finish line. It's a race to get the budgets done. It's a race to get a stake in the ground. It's a race to make a decision. So really speed is a huge factor in the world that we live in.
Really good point. Really good point. So as we think about how this translates to, I'll call it, they build up experience. That's true too. So the experience from the teams, they're learning from past experiences, and they're oftentimes using that to innovate and do a better job in the future. So what's interesting about this to me in relation to where we're at as an industry is that you looked in the past at a room full of draftspeople that were creating these blueprints and these designs by hand. And, let's say this was 1981. You look at today, it's really not that different. Yes, we have computers, and yes, we're doing more digital work, but are we really light years ahead? Are we really that Formula One team that's like a minute faster than the other team? Are we really bringing the best innovations and tools to the market? I personally don't think so. So what we see, at least from where we sit as Transcend, is that the typical process of designing a plant is just like it used to be in 1981, with a little bit of adoption on the AutoCAD side, or a little bit of adoption on the design technology and use of computers. But generally, this whole process is extremely cumbersome and complex. And it takes hundreds, if not thousands, of manual hours from every engineer involved with the project. And if there's any changes, it sometimes requires complete revisions. So I still feel like we as Transcend still feel like in many cases we're stuck in the 1980s or 1990s or even early 2000s. We haven't made that significant advancement. So the question is, what if there was a better way? What if there were consulting firms that adopted advances in innovation to bring more value to the table, to be faster, to be more efficient, to do better work? So one example of this, that as we see it and we've experienced it, is with the Trinity River Authority in Texas. They're a very large U.S. utility in the Dallas-Fort Worth metro. They have a number of different wastewater treatment plants, one of which is a 24 MGD plant, which is the one we're going to be talking about today. So they had a master plan out that was an upgrade to this treatment plant. And as part of this RFP, they requested that the engineering consulting firms responding propose 3 different scenarios for this upgrade. They wanted to look at future effluent requirements, increased loads from population growth, and increased flows to the plant due to wet weather. And when they found out about a tool like Transcend's, what was interesting is that they felt like they could do a lot more. They could ask a lot more from these consulting firms, keeping the same time and budget that they had. So they actually wrote an addendum to this RFP. I'm going to show you a bunch of text on the screen. I do want you to take 30, 45 seconds to read through it, and we'll talk about what stands out, how these engineering firms are forced to adopt innovation. So here's the text of the new RFP, or the amended RFP. So if you are in the engineering consulting world, you will probably be shocked right now. I've been in the room when the consulting firms are reading through this or are presented with this, and their jaws hit the ground. As a reminder, the original RFP wanted to look at 30 scenarios. The original wanted to look at 3 scenarios. The amended wanted to look at 30 scenarios. This is basically asking the consulting firms to go from 1991 F1 team to 2022 F1 team in the span of this much time, overnight. So a couple things stood out about this to me. One was, of course, that 30 number, which we just talked about. But this one, the utilizing conceptual design software to automate the biology and engineering calcs. So we don't want you to perform this work manually anymore. We want it to be automated. This is the language from the utility. And by the way, we want you to generate a 3D BIM model every single time you do these analyses. We want you to use the latest innovations in design technology to do this work. So the question becomes, how did the consulting engineers adopt this innovation? How did they adopt technology? So what we did and what these consulting firms did was first assess the original 3 scenarios that the utility wanted to look at. And a lot of people will ask, well, why in the world do they want to assess 30 different options? And the reason is because there's so many different possibilities within each option that the utility wanted to evaluate to have a better master plan. So as an example, in the temperature range, perhaps it's a higher temp than expected. It could be that more industry is moving in that they aren't anticipating in 5-10 years. That may drastically change what the influent characteristics look like. It may also be, though, low variability, might be the same as it is today, or it could be somewhere in between, medium. There's 3 new scenarios that didn't plan to be incorporated as part of the original RFP. Similarly, on the technology options, looking at things like how technology might impact the operational expense, the footprint, different treatment technologies. So as you start to expand, you see how the range of possibilities become so great. And it's not just a possibility within one temperature range, it's the temperature range multiplied by the population growth, multiplied by the footprint, multiplied by a treatment technology. So the number of options is so vast. So as a consulting firm, they're thinking there's no way I can do this without some type of innovation in technology. So what ends up happening is that with a tool like Transcend, the consulting firm actually are forced to basically create these designs up front and then evaluate them using their smarts, the same number of people, and the engineers do higher level work. They have a lot more fun at their job. So what ends up happening is you create all of these different outputs across the engineering disciplines automatically, and then the utility can actually assess the best alternative with the help of the consulting engineer. So in this case, you have a complete site layout for each of those options, and the utility can say, hey, I know we wanted to look at 3, but now we're going to look at 30, and here's how that's going to impact the treatment plant in terms of the new expansion. So in this case, the consulting firms evaluated activated sludge versus MBBR. So in the tool, what happens is you create basically a no build zone or where existing assets are, and the software will automatically select size and design and propose a layout for all of the new assets. So even though this utility originally said, hey, this is a conventional plant, and we only want you to evaluate conventional options, with a tool like ours, they can evaluate more scenarios. So in this case, what's the difference between an activated sludge footprint and an MBBR footprint? And you can see the difference between the two quite quickly. MBBR is much more compact. So utility has a new option to evaluate. So again, for this project specifically, the consulting firms were forced to look at a number of different scenarios. But of course, we're just scratching the surface with basically the 3 to 5 permutations of the ones that are highlighted in yellow. But there's so much more that can be done with a new innovation in technology. So I think the key here too, and why consulting firms sometimes are hesitant to adopt new technologies, is that they feel like new tech is risky. It hasn't been proven. Show me that it works. Show me that it works somewhere else in the world. Show me that it's worked for the same client before. But in reality, many technologies are actually help manage risk or help mitigate risk, because you can evaluate so many different possibilities. In the case of Transcend or tools and technologies like the ones Kim will discuss, you're actually helping sort of put the risk in a bubble and better define it and better manage it. So I'll leave you with this last thing. It's not possible to create resilient infrastructure by continuing to do the same things we've always done. We can't be the Formula One team of the 1980s or 1990s. We have to be the Formula One team of 2022 and in the future. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Kim. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll be sure to answer that. And awesome. Let's see what Kim has to say.
Awesome. Well, I've never, have to say this is the first time I've ever heard Formula One intersect engineering design. So pretty cool. And there is a lot of engineering design that goes into that process. So I guess we should be talking about those two things simultaneously more often. Awesome. All right. Well, before I jump into a little bit of what Elemental does, I want to do a bit of a live poll. So it looks like there's a handful of you. I'd love to ask, if you are in the consulting engineering world or engineering world in general, have you been in your position or in the world of engineering for more than, let's say, 25 years? Can you use the little hand function, or feel free to come off video and just raise your actual hand there? Who's been in the consulting engineering world for more than 25 years? Nobody. All right. How about more than 10 years? Anybody awake up there? Who's been there more than 10 years? Okay. More than 5?
I'm wondering if we have any consulting engineers on the call now.
Yeah, are there any consulting engineers? Okay, we got a 5. Are the rest of y'all technology manufacturers or service providers of some other kind? Give me a thumbs up. Okay. All right, so we've got a few. There we go. Okay, interesting. Okay, well, congratulations, because you guys are designing the future. There's always a champion within an organization that has been long established that is going to be the domino to push everybody else over. So congratulations. It seems like we've got the right folks on the phone today. I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about what Elemental does and how that impacts the decisions that we make on investment, and how that can, in a lot of ways, trickle down to you all as either design engineers, OEMs, sort of everybody has a piece in the world of stakeholders that get this technology to market, which is so incredibly important. So I am always the worst at sharing my screen, so I'm going to do that. Let's see here. So we got this one. I will share, and then I will share the slideshow. All right, so Elemental Accelerator is a global nonprofit, but we are also an investor. If you had to give us a tagline, you could call us a nonprofit VC. Little outside of the box there, but that's what we're up to. We have deployed investments into about 150 companies. We've been doing this for about 10 years, and we invest at the intersection of climate change and social justice. So we're thinking about those frontline communities that are most heavily impacted by climate change. In the news these days, we're seeing these incredible flooding events where buildings are falling off cliffs and people are heavily impacted. We're seeing fires. Unfortunately, that one hits quite close to home. So we're thinking about those communities that may not have as many resources, that may be at the front line of the impact that we're feeling of climate change. And we're looking to see how technology can work at that intersection point to alleviate some of the burden, but also change the path of the future that we are destined to follow. So that's kind of the thesis behind what we're up to. At the end of the day, what we're doing is we're really supporting the entrepreneurs. The Transcend team has been fabulous to work with. We have been an investor in Transcend now for a number of years. We've watched the company really grow. We've also watched them really influence the industry as a whole, which is really awesome. So, you know, we're thinking about everything. It's all connected. So despite the fact that we're talking about water today, we really think about the fact that all of these systems are connected. Water impacts energy, which also impacts mobility. We think about the food that we eat, the agriculture that we need to grow and consume, as well as something that we call the circular economy. Sort of in more traditional terms, it's waste management. Where does the waste go, and how do we alleviate that waste going to the landfill? So we're thinking about these things as an overall approach. And the beautiful thing about this is all of this is heavily engineered, heavily technical solutions. So despite you might be sitting there saying, well, the energy industry is totally different than water, or it's totally different than food and ag, that's actually not what we see. We see that these industries do parallel each other in many, many ways. And so I think the discussion here today, specific to water is actually like a gate that gets opened to the broader conversation. I'll take you through some of our investment criteria. If you've done any investment in the past, this probably seems quite simple, but I'm going to talk a little bit deeper about one of them. So you've got to have the right people in the right team. That one probably seems obvious, but when you're doing something that's really hard, which is bringing a new technology to the water industry, you need the people that have the resilience, the intelligence, the relationship building capabilities to really make that happen. Because at the end of the day, everybody on this call, it's about you and me and sort of who can support in some way. It's not always about writing a check. It's maybe about taking a meeting. It's about making an introduction. It's about doing something together to shift this industry as a whole, because it's our responsibility as a collective audience to move the industry forward, to move the water industry forward. It's not Adam's job. It's not my job. It's all of our jobs together. So I invite you to think about how you can support these teams. Even if it's like the smallest little thing along your day, it will make an impact as we drive the industry forward overall. So we think about how these technologies are locally deployable and globally scalable. That is where the engineering comes in. We have to understand the boundary conditions of a place where we're going to put a technology into. Part of what I do is I speak to the customers, I speak to the client, I speak to oftentimes the engineer that would be working on delivering a project. So I have to be honest, I'm probably right on the fence of that question, like, do engineers help or hinder the development? I know they are needed. I know that everybody has a place in the sort of stakeholder map of getting these technologies through. But when we are looking at getting a new technology to market, it's absolutely something I key on immediately. The question is, do they have the right engineering group? Do they have the engineering group that has the understanding of the market dynamic and the risk level changing to get in there and actually do something about it? So on that note, I'm going to give you a very localized example. I live in the LA area. It's 100 degrees right now. It will be for about 5 days. I think we're going to hit something like 102, 105, which is rare for this time of year. And at the same time, Metropolitan Water District, the wholesaler, is replacing a 36-mile pipeline. So there is a watering ban for 2 weeks. Now imagine you're someone that lives in inner city LA, you don't have air conditioning, and you can't turn the hose on to let your kids run through it, or you can't water your garden. It's a problem. It really hits home. So we think about these things from a localized concept as well. Obviously, you need to have a financial stability and a financial path. I'm not going to talk too much about that. You have to be solving those urgent environmental challenges. So this one I want to talk about. So with that local example, where do decisions get made? In this industry, it's about risk. Adam, you said that already. It's when the risk factors outweigh the risk of doing nothing. So I'll let you sit with that for a minute. In the example of the 3 design iterations versus the 30, the risk of doing nothing in that scenario is completely losing the customer, completely losing the contract. Guess what? That risk profile has now shifted. In the example of a leaking pipeline in the LA district, the risk of not paying attention to degrading infrastructure has now become greater than the risk of trying something new. We have to try something new in this sector as we start to see things crumbling. And so that's when the engineer comes in, because often, for better or worse, that engineer owns the risk. They're often the ones that are stamping designs. They're often the ones making decisions on placement, on timeline, on budget. They're answering to the customer. So yes, I know the engineer owns that risk, but if the engineering firms can't get on board in time, the sector is going to move forward without them, because now the risk of no change means buildings falling off of cliffs, means fires, means, water lines breaking, et cetera, et cetera. So we're really starting to see that dynamic change. Okay, the last one, which I'm going to jump into a little bit more. So we are a commercial accelerator. We're looking to achieve 10x scale growth. So something we really, really, really hone in on when we're looking at technology, whether it's hardware or software, is can they meet these growth sort of targets, over the next couple of years. So customer traction and paying customers and strategic partners are really what can make or break a company. I'm going to throw one more graph at you. This one's a zoomed in. People on the phone, you've probably heard of TRL, technology readiness level. We have a different scale that we've mapped against that, which is commercial readiness level. And so here you see the prototype actually goes to TRL like 9. You have to have a widget that's ready to put in the ground to go do something about it. But then what we're focusing on is sort of like this number 4 to 5 area through market leadership. So we call these commercial inflection points. I feel like inflection point is the new sustainability buzzword. We're at an inflection point. So we start with companies that are usually around a 4 or 5, maybe a 6, and we're thinking about who are the people in this stack that need to get the company to an 8 or a 9, etc. The answer is the consulting engineer has to be part of that puzzle, despite how painful it can often be. And it really can be painful. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'll keep going. So one thing that we use as a discussion point in the companies as we train them is something called the Goldilocks method. It's a sales term that's coined by Nina Ali. She's one of our sales coaches. The Goldilocks method determines when, how, and why you might go through various, you being the startup, go through various partnerships related to sales. And at some point, the consulting engineer has to come in. And at some point, that consulting engineer is going to be cut out because they're just too difficult to get over the hurdle. And if you're that consulting engineer that gets cut out when you have buildings falling off cliffs or when you have water mains breaking, that risk profile has now changed and you've been left behind because there's somebody else that's willing to come to the table. So when I look to invest in water, wastewater technologies, it's not necessarily like, do they have a consulting engineer or not? It's, do they have the right partnership? Do they have the right consulting engineer that's willing to take a little bit of risk up front to then be at the table when we have this sort of like, oh shit, reality moment that hits us in the face? So I'll talk a little bit about hardware because I know a lot of you out there are designing hardware, building hardware, or selling hardware. And something that I'm seeing happen more and more, and I actually see it as a really good thing because, again, thinking about speed, we want to bring technologies to market quickly, yet responsibly. We want to see the companies grow and see that impact grow quickly, yet responsibly. We want to reach that 10x scale and that sort of number 8 commercial inflection point on that scale. And something that I've seen as a workaround, because startups have to be nimble, they have to change, is modularity. So modularity in design allows less design work. It allows flexibility sort of to and from customer needs across, across the sector, across California, across the world, much faster. So I've seen hardware companies go through maybe one design package where they know they can tweak a few things on either end, but then largely cut out that engineer from the discussion. Or maybe you just have sort of auxiliary engineering going on. It's not true design. It's not true design and build happening. And I'm seeing a lot of water treatment technologies doing that as a means to an end, as a means to speed, as a means to integration, as a means to being there at the table when the risk becomes a reality. And the consulting engineer is going, oh, I used to work with them. They asked me for help like 5 years ago. And I'm going, well, duh, like do something about it, move forward with something. So I'd say that's definitely something that we're starting to see. The other thing that we're starting to see is, and everybody on the line is probably experiencing this in some way, and that's why I wanted to do the poll, is we're really seeing a shift in the people. And at the end of the day, we're all people. We're all making our own decisions. We're all human. And we're starting to see this younger workforce emerge. And so often, especially at the larger firms, I'd say, there's a younger dynamic coming to the table that is maybe a little bit more interested in taking a bit of a risk, trying something new. And I'm seeing these pairings really be a beautiful thing in terms of getting technology to market. So if a company comes to me and says, hey, we don't know the CEO, but we've got this incredible strategic partnership that we're building with someone in middle management, maybe a project manager, maybe a director of some sort. maybe a leader of a business unit, I'm like, amazing, this is going to work because I know we've got the right personalities at the table. So it's something that we look for in sort of that Goldilocks method. It's about the right time, the right channels, the right partnerships, but it's also about having the right people. And there's a number of ways to do this. If the engineer gets cut out, you can work with a sales rep that has a greater capacity for design. If the engineer gets cut out, a company will take some of that on itself. There's like a number of new financing mechanisms inside of a startup that allows them to take in more of that in-house design work on their own. And they're doing that on purpose because they're trying to achieve that speed and that scale. Because if they don't, they're not a company anymore. The risk, again, the risk of them doing nothing and waiting around for that engineering team is that they go out of business. And so they will do something about it. And so I'm looking for those companies that are saying, here are the factors that I need to line up. Here are the people that I need to work with. And if not, I'm going to go around the engineer. And I say, great, that sounds like a great plan. And so that's the reality. So I've said enough. I think I'll stop there, Adam, and see where we want to take the conversation from here.
I want to know if anyone in the audience has any questions. Feel free to come off mute.
Is anybody that champion? Who's that champion? I want to know. Adam, I'll tell it. Oh, JP, you were going to say something.
No, I would say a great presentation. My only comment is that I know that a lot of people are not making decisions, but if you're not going to make a decision, I think you're going to be disrupted by someone else. So it's not about you and your decision. It's also about the industry and the new players. We see a lot of startups coming up with new innovative technologies. So if I were working in this space, I will make sure I understand what's going on. And innovation also means taking a risk, a calculated risk, and making sure that you form partnerships with organizations like yours or Transcend, where you can explore. And you can come up with the pilot or an exploration mode to reduce the risk. But again, I think the name of the game is innovation, like Adam say, and I invite everybody to consider that. If you're not doing it, someone else will, and that can be dangerous for your business.
True, very true. I was going to tell a quick story. As a young engineer, I was like, hey, this sustainability thing is pretty cool. We should maybe do this. So we set up a sustainability team internally. We did, like print on 2 sides. We did the basics. And then I said, well, like, we should sell this. Like, why don't we have a sustainability team and customers doing like sustainability, quote unquote? And everyone was like, what? What is this? So now look forward, I don't know, 15 years. Guess what? We should have been doing sustainability. We should have been doing greenhouse gas. We should have been doing green business work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We would have been at the front of the line. And so sometimes it's just being, I hate to say it, but the loudest person in the room to sort of raise that flag and say, this is the future. And I always look for that in a partnership for a company. Like, do they have someone raising the flag on their behalf?
Okay, any topics people want to discuss? Questions? If not, we can keep it short and sweet.
Well, Adam, I want to know where you are on the scale. I told everybody I was sort of in the middle. Either get on board or get out of the way.
Some days I'm like, we're doomed because the consulting engineers are just not going to move. Other days there's not only hope, but it's actually happening. But it's in pockets for sure. So like what you're saying, it's typically an individual within the firm who's like, I see the writing on the wall. Billable hours are probably going to go away at some point. We need to deliver outcomes and not hours. And they're working actively to change how their organization functions. They're hiring new talent. They're spinning up products, right? They're doing all kinds of stuff. And other days it's like, nope, I'm cool, status quo. Like, gonna bill my hours, submit my change orders, and life is good. But I think that the people that are on that side are not gonna last much longer. Right. Maybe another decade, couple decades at most, but there's just no way you can thrive in this environment if you're not changing.
Yeah. They're gatekeepers until we break the gate down in a lot of
Yes.
ways.
Yeah, until they don't have a gate anymore and they're like,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
I'm in trouble.
Yeah. And it's true, if a company can come and say like, hey, I'm going to take these 5 steps around the consultant, great, go for it.
I got a question in the chat of how do you typically find those champions and where do you typically see them within an organization?
Oof. Kim, do you want to take it or?
I think you should. You're living this.
Sure. So a couple of things immediately come to mind. The first is that I'm a pretty big advocate for being vocal on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. When you find other people who are actively posting about innovation, or you see they're presenting at conferences on innovation, or they have maybe some challenging viewpoints as to where the industry is and where it needs to go, those people typically are really loud voices internally as well. They may not be able to make a decision, but oftentimes they can be a champion and get you introduced to the right people who can make a decision. The other thing that we found is that it's typically not the executive level folks that are the ones that are going to drive the change. Unfortunately, they should be. And oftentimes it's not the like entry level engineers that are doing it either. They may be the ones using the tools or assessing the tools, but they're not the ones that actually change the org. What we're finding, it's this middle tier. Typically, if we're going by age, it's somewhere between like 35 to 45 that are working towards becoming executives in the company, that are actively wanting to change, that are high potential candidates inside of those companies. They're the ones that we find are the best champions for us, because not only can they drive change, but they can make decisions. So that's who we are focused on now, talking to, are those people. We're speaking about engineering consulting firms specifically.
Yeah, I'll take it one step sort of higher level, bird's eye view from how we think about the world and what we invest in and who we want to partner with. We think about it from the community side of it as well, because whether or not an engineer a consultant is designing the system, or the technology OEM is designing the system, the receiver of that at some point in time is the community. It will get installed. It will be placed out in the world where people like you and me and the people that, you know, are most impacted by climate, flooding, fires, etc., is that community. And so how do we pull them as an entire stakeholder group to the front of the conversation? This is what Elemental designs its projects to do, because sometimes the community, those gatherings, a nonprofit that's a huge advocacy group in the area, is the tipping point. They are the domino. Maybe they're not internal to that consulting firm, but if they're all sort of raising their hands, often we have mayors involved. If the mayor's all of a sudden raising his hand and saying like, yes, I want 30, iterations of a design so I can see what the land layout looks like in my neighborhood, then everybody has to sort of get on board. It's then not about risk. It's not about that tipping point. It's about, the masses coming together and influencing a decision. And so we see this as a really powerful way to sort of get those right stakeholder groups to the place that they need to be to say yes and get on board. And then it's a win for everybody, because they get to provide input on how they want to see the world, how they want to experience their daily lives. And the company, whether it's Transcend or a hardware company, can actually think about how to make that technology longest lasting out in the world, which is just a win. That's what you ask for in terms of customer feedback all day long. You want to see technology stick. And so that's the way that we see it. That's what we're up to and how we design our projects. So I think there's a few technology providers out there. Think about that. And if you can perhaps integrate that into your sales methodology there, in your Goldilocks method by Nina.
Okay, if there are no more questions or no one else wants to talk through, we'll let you go, give you some time back. We appreciate you joining, and stay tuned on updates from Transcend. We're doing some cool stuff. As we walk towards sustainability, innovation, new technologies does not come cheap.
Well, let me talk about that for a second. Actually, it's a very real scenario. And what I would invite you to explore is alternative funding. So yes, I know that because of the way that the consulting budgets are structured, there's not a huge overhead capacity to be like, I'm just going to take a swing for $1 million and see what happens. That's not the way it works. There are organizations like Elemental, like LACI, LACI, like Greentown Labs, like NYSERDA. I'm rattling off a ton. We can put them in the chat. There is money coming down from IRA. That is looking to be the enabler. So it comes often in terms of co-funding. Sometimes it comes in terms of a grant. Sometimes it's via investment into the company itself. But I would say don't let that sort of stop you. I would say go explore some local funding opportunities to bring to the table, because if you are that internal champion and you bring money to the table from an external source, that's a big win for your career as well. So yes, totally noted, and is a very real dynamic for the sector, especially the water sector. But I would say shake the money tree outside of your organization and see if you can get some money elsewhere. Oh, one more plug, Adam. They've got to follow you on LinkedIn, follow Transcend on LinkedIn, right? Follow Elemental, you can find me. So yeah, let's build a community.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Keep in touch, and hopefully we'll see you for the next one.